Hello and welcome to the Energy Transition Talk, the podcast that explores the challenges and opportunities of transitioning to a lower carbon future. I'm Paulina.
I'm Justine.
And I'm Jim.
And we are your hosts for the Energy Transition Talk.
In this podcast, we seek to break down some of the most complex and important issues regarding the energy transition and how it impacts us. In each episode, we'll tell you a story by bringing you various perspectives about the energy transition so that you can make the best and most informed decisions for you and your communities. In this episode, we will explore the connections between energy, water, and climate systems as it relates to energy poverty and access to critical energy services. Today, we are delighted to speak with Dr. Kelly Sanders, Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at USC, and three of her PhD students, Stepp, McKenna, and Andrew, who have been working on research projects related to renewable energy adoption and access to cooling in dealing with extreme heat.
Let's dive into this further with Dr. Kelly Sanders.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders, for joining us today. Dr. Sanders is an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at USC, where she teaches classes on energy and the environment. Her research aims to reduce the environment impacts of providing energy and water, analyze tensions between climate change and adaptation and mitigation strategies, and anticipate the effects of climate change on energy systems. She has authored over 24 publications and is a frequent speaker on topics at the intersections of engineering, science, and policy. Dr. Sanders has been recognized for her contributions to the energy field in the Forbes 30 Under 30, Today's Disruptions and Tomorrow's Brightest Stars, as well as the MIT Technology Review's 35 Innovators Under 35. Her research and commentary has been featured in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, The Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, Wired Magazine, Forbes, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, and The Scientific American. Dr. Sanders received her bachelor's in bioengineering from Pennsylvania State University, as well as a master's in mechanical engineering and a PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you, Dr. Sanders, for joining us today on Energy Transition Talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
So maybe just to get started, could you tell us a little bit about your background and interest in the connections between energy, water, and the climate systems, maybe what inspired you to focus on your research topic and what makes you passionate about the energy transition?
Yeah, so if you listen to my background, I had kind of a circuitous path to get here to teaching at USC in energy systems. Back when I was 18, I was really interested in helping people. And so as a freshman, I went into a bioengineering program with the idea that I would help people who had gotten hurt get rehabilitated through bioengineering technologies. And then I graduated with that degree, and I kind of got swept away in this conversation about climate. So I was thinking about graduate school, and I was really thinking about how to make a big impact. And I was already an engineer, and I got really, really interested in energy systems. They're very multidisciplinary. You think about physics, you think about biology, you think about chemistry. And so I enrolled in a PhD program at the University of Texas, and I worked with my advisor, whose name is Dr. Michael Weber, and he really takes a holistic look at this energy problem. So he thinks about the technologies within the context of economic constraints and policy constraints. And so that's kind of really permeated throughout my career. I'm really interested in energy systems as a whole and how they operate within the world. And so here at USC, I started out extending the research that I was doing as a doctoral student. I was looking at the relationship between energy and water systems, because our energy systems require a lot of water to function. So we use a lot of water to produce oil and gas, to produce electricity. And lately, I've been taking kind of a bigger picture approach. How do our energy systems operate within the function or within the context of a changing climate more generally? So climate is really impacting our energy systems because we're using more air conditioning, for example. So my group looks into how warming is changing the way that we behave with our energy system. And then we're also looking at the other side of the coin, thinking about how does the grid itself decarbonize, and what are some of the challenges associated with that? So we look at a lot, but really I'm interested in how these systems interact with each other. How does energy and climate talk to each other? And then also, how do those systems impact the environment more generally?
Yeah, that's great. And we're really grateful to have your broader, interdisciplinary perspective here. The topic for today is energy poverty. Maybe just to set the stage, could you define what energy poverty is, and what is the scope of it? How serious of an issue is it? Does it impact only certain regions or a lot of geographic areas? Like, what is the scope of the issue?
Yeah, so energy poverty in its most simplistic sense is the inability for someone to pay for enough energy to meet their basic needs. So said more simply, at what point does someone's finances restrict them from getting enough energy to meet their well-being, their quality of life requirements? And so, nearly 800 million people globally don't have access to electricity. And that's the statistic we often think about when we think about energy poverty or energy inaccess. But the issue, the challenge is much, much broader than that. So here in the United States, which is, one of the richest countries in the world, a third of the population is energy insecure, meaning that they at some point have lacked the resources to purchase enough energy for cooling or heating or, meeting their basic needs to be comfortable, which has negatively impacted their well-being. We've seen this Ukraine-Russia war, impact Europe and how Europeans have to pay much higher energy bills now, which has restricted the amount of energy they might need for cooling their homes in summer and also heating their homes in winter. So this isn't a problem that is isolated to poorer countries. This is really an issue that permeates throughout the world, and it's getting worse with time. So, the world right now is experiencing unprecedented heat. Much of the world doesn't have access to AC. So climate change is really, really exacerbating some of these issues that already existed before, it got really, really bad.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make, that it doesn't just affect developed countries, not just developing countries, but it affects all countries around the world. And kind of, we've heard the term just transition a lot, the idea that, we need to address climate change more broadly. It's not just about accelerating renewables and phasing out coal. So I'm wondering what a just transition looks like, and why is it so important that we put people and communities at the center of the energy transition?
So a lot of times we think about the climate crisis through the lens of decarbonization. So we think about just how do we reduce carbon. The idea of the just transition is, how do we put people at the center of that question? And just to give, a very, very simple example, a policy lever that we could pull to make this transition go really, really fast is we could make gas $15 a gallon. But that would absolutely devastate the middle and lower classes here. People wouldn't be able to get to work. They wouldn't be able to, maintain their livelihood. And so while that might be good for environmental or climate sustainability, it does really bad in the realms of economic sustainability or social sustainability. So thinking through a just transition, we really have to think about how we move towards decarbonized solutions and also adaptation strategies. Adaptation is a huge part of this conversation, that protect people, but also don't punish people throughout. And that's a hard optimization. It's hard to think through the three prongs of environmental, social, and economic sustainability, but we absolutely have to for this to be successful.
And I think that it's very important what you're saying about adaptation and these different spheres, and thinking of kind of this as a background, in your opinion, what are the biggest challenges other global economies will face moving towards renewable energy and thinking of developing nations?
Yeah, so, this was always going to be a really, really big challenge, getting from a system which right now sits at 80% fossil fuels globally, to a system that's almost or will become net zero is the ultimate goal. That's always been really hard, and the last few years have made it a lot harder. So with COVID and a number of other, global challenges that the world has been facing, a lot of countries are in debt crises. And that basically means that financing these new technologies has gotten much, much more expensive. And people and governments are charged with meeting their own basic needs. This whole climate thing is of a lesser priority when you don't know how you're going to access your next meal or your next glass of drinking water or taking care of your newborn infant. So COVID has exacerbated a lot of these challenges. We really need to think about how we're going to get the money to do this, and that's going to require innovations in financing. But we also have to think about the social and the societal transition associated with this, because there's a lot of mistrust of governments, distrust of governments. There's a lot of, political instability around the world that restricts some of these challenges. There's incumbent actors, so there's the fossil fuel industries themselves, which might wield a lot of power in some of these nations. And there's also people that depend on those jobs currently. So if you just yank those jobs away, people lose access to their livelihood. So there's really a plethora of challenges that, again, thinking through this idea of the just transition, how do you implement these solutions and then take the people along with you?
Yeah, that's a pretty daunting set of challenges there. And kind of moving on to solutions, I guess, can you walk us through some of the options? Like, what are the potential solutions or ways for developing countries to adopt clean energy while continuing to grow their economies and reach sustainable development goals? And maybe if there are any trade-offs with each approach?
Yeah, so again, this is a really, really complex issue. But just, thinking through the most obvious strategy is just access to money, right? Like, this transition is going to cost a lot for the United States. It's going to cost a lot for Europe. It's going to cost a lot for these developing nations. And one of the benefits that the Western world has, that, the United States and Europe has, for example, is that renewable energy in a lot of these markets is actually the cheapest option. So in a lot of places around the United States, for example, solar and or wind is actually cheaper than building a new natural gas facility or building a new coal facility. There's some challenges with those technologies, and there might be opposition to those technologies, but from a cost perspective, they actually are really cheap. That is not the case in a lot of these developing countries. So like I mentioned before, a lot of these countries are in debt crisis. And that means that it's really hard for them to access financing. It's very difficult for them to get the capital to pay for these investments. And it's also really, really difficult to attract investors because people don't trust that the money that they invest is ultimately going to come back to them. So we kind of need a new business model for thinking about how we get these countries to be able to transition from a cost perspective. Everyone's heard about this, development fund, the $100 billion that was supposed to go to the developing world. And, the rich world really hasn't come through on that commitment. But even that $100 billion that was promised to these countries is just, the tip of the iceberg in terms of the amount of financing that's going to be needed. So we really have to think about what are sustainable financing models that will facilitate this transition, but that will also not in-depth these countries forever, so that they're, forever trying to pay back this debt. So making the business model a little bit more sustainable. We also need to think about the communities themselves. So in a lot of places, there's, like I said before, there's this distrust of government, and there's a distrust of foreign actors kind of coming in and implementing new technologies and asking people, get rid of your biomass cook stoves and choose something else, leave your job at the coal-fired power plant because we're gonna, do something else here. That's scary for a lot of communities, and for a lot of reasons, that mistrust, that distrust is really warranted. So unfortunately, the solutions aren't necessarily scalable here. You have to look at these solutions in the context of the local community. Who are the trusted representatives? Is it a religious figure? Is it a tribal elder? Is it a labor union? Is it the government? For different countries, for different regions, for different tribes, that answer is going to be different. And you really have to get that stakeholder engagement to get these communities to kind of adopt and welcome these new technologies. And I think part of that is the economic development. So there's been a lot of failed examples where rich countries have gone into, let's just call it sub-Saharan Africa. They've installed water systems or sanitation systems or solar systems. They built it and they left, and the thing breaks. And there was no there was no attempt to work within the cultural confines of the community. And so this infrastructure is now just not being used. It's broken. So we really have to think about, what are the retraining opportunities? How do we make these new industries part of the local economy and an asset to the local economy? So how do we use this transition to actually build up industries within these communities? And make them economically independent so that they benefit the community members that use them. A lot of times we think through, electrification through the lens of the house. Can people get light for reading, which is good for education? Can people get, more sustainable energy for cooking and cooling and heating? And while that's a really good focus, I think we need to focus a lot also on the industries within these communities, because if you build a sustainable industry that requires electrification, requires the use of the solar plant or the wind plant, you're not only bringing electrification to that community that surrounds this new economic opportunity for these people, but all of those people benefit from this new source of revenue for this location. So I think just the theme here is we really need to think more holistically about these solutions. Don't just focus, don't put your box around the solar panels, put your box around the community. Like, how do you make this viable from an economic perspective so that it's just not a cost, but it actually brings in revenue over time and serves the people that require it.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back on the financing point, so to provide some context, I believe it was 2015 during the Paris Agreement, where wealthy countries pledged that $100 billion a year to help countries, developing countries, reduce their emissions and adapt to the effects of climate change. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts on, for the amount of money that is getting transferred, is there a way that this money can be used to help economic development at the local level?
Yeah, so, some analysis on that number suggests that a very small fraction of that number has actually been disseminated to these communities. And, I think an organization within the United Nations says that we need something on the order of $6 trillion by 2030 to even get a fraction of the commitments of the developing countries toward that decarbonization goal. So I think the money is very important. And I think there's a moral case here. The United States and Europe and the rich world at large has benefited from the use of fossil fuels over the last few hundred years, which has gotten us to the place that we're in. These developing countries aren't a very large fraction of the carbon budget, and they're also getting disproportionately impacted by the consequences of climate change. They are also the regions that are growing most rapidly. So not only do you have a situation in which we need to meet the basic needs of these countries, but we also need to meet their growth. And so kind of circling back to your question about how this money gets disseminated, it's hard because it's not enough money to meet the needs. So how do you dole it out? Who gets it? How do you prioritize where the money goes? How do you make it benefit and come back to the communities as we just discussed? Unfortunately, I don't have the answer, but we need to think harder about the challenge. You know, we really need to think about how we make the money go farther. A lot of times, you know, here in the United States, just to give you an example, a lot of times we direct our climate adaptation money, you know, money that would benefit communities to protect them from the consequences of climate change. We spend that money to protect value, right? So we try to save the most expensive homes or the most expensive infrastructure. And that's not necessarily maximizing the benefits to the communities, you know? So it's not a one-dimensional problem here. It's a multifaceted problem. So we really have to think holistically about how that money gets out to address some of these challenges.
And maybe like different ways, as you were saying, is having examples of success stories that can be maybe pathways into moving forward. So can you think of any of these success stories of developing countries or specific regions that have made significant progress in renewable energy adoption, or maybe examples within California that we can learn from?
Sure. So, you know, one of the examples that is most common to state here is Costa Rica. You know, Costa Rica is, you know, not a very, very rich country, and it has managed to get to an electricity system where much of the time it's operating with almost 100% renewable electricity. And that's a really incredible achievement, you know, and one of the really neat things about that achievement is they've actually leveraged a tourism industry based on that success story. So, you know, there's college students across the country and across the world that go to Costa Rica to learn about their electricity system and do ecotourism and, you know, focus on the ecosystems and learn about environmental sustainability. So that has been a really huge success story for Costa Rica about how they've made some investments, how they've reached this level of success, and then how they're actually leveraging those investments to bring more back to the local economy. Now, as much as that's a success story, Costa Rica is also in a really unique situation. They have enormous amounts of hydropower for the amount of electricity that their population requires. And so they've been able to build some wind and build some solar, but at the heart of that system is this incredible hydropower resource, which makes it a little bit easier to balance some of those renewables. And that's not to detract from the success story, but it's also to underscore each country is going to have its own unique challenges based on its economic situation, but also just its renewable resources. You know, some countries are cloudy, some countries aren't coastal, so they might not have as much wind opportunity as other countries. So there certainly have been success stories in terms of, you know, building out these renewable energy systems. But it's hard sometimes to say success based on this or failure based on this, because, you have to look at the complexities of this, of the challenges of decarbonization and the local economy and resources, et cetera. California is a really interesting situation because we're kind of going first here in the United States, and we're really serving as a model for US states, but also the rest of the world more broadly. We're building out an electricity system here that, for a very, very small fraction of time last year had nearly 100% renewable electricity. So we met, over 95% of our system was being served by renewables for a very small portion of the day. And that's a challenging system to manage right now. And quite honestly, we don't know how to manage a system that gets very, very high fractions of variable renewable energies like wind and like solar. There have been countries that have done it. So for example, there's Denmark and its wind power. It has very, very high fractions of wind at some hours of the day. But when that wind exceeds what the local communities need, they can actually export it to other countries. So that's kind of how they've had their success story. Obviously, that's not something that can be replicated everywhere because you can't export electricity everywhere all at the same time. So California is trying to figure that out now. How do you import power? How do you export power? How do you build in storage? So we've made huge investments in energy storage over the last few years. We're thinking about something called demand response. So how do you get people like you and me to use the dishwasher or use the washing machine when solar resources are really, really strong? And then to reduce those loads, at 6, 7, 8 p.m., depending on the time of year when those solar resources diminish, and the system is mostly natural gas. So we have to start thinking not only about the supply side of the equation, which we're used to thinking about, batteries, renewables, and we're starting to think more about the demand side of the equation. How do we time our electricity usage? How, increasingly, how do we charge our cars when there's a lot of renewable energy available? That's a conversation that's just now starting, but we really have to get that integrated into our psyche. That, again, taking California as an example, using electricity in the middle of the day is almost carbon free, especially in the spring when you have a lot of hydro, a lot of wind, and a lot of solar. But at 6 p.m., it's almost all natural gas and fossil fuels. So, depending on when you choose to consume your electricity, you have different carbon consequences. And we've really never had a system like that. So California is trying to figure it out, and we're going to have some bumps along the way. I'm trying to incorporate more and more variable renewable energy. But I know that you're talking to some of my students later in the show. So they'll, talk about some of the research that we've been doing in that area.
We'd love to kind of conclude about things, given all the challenges that we face in dealing with energy poverty and energy transition. What inspires or motivates you about the future of energy? Both, dealing with fighting climate change, but at the same time, increasing access to critical energy services.
Yeah, so, I think it's easy to get stuck in, the despair of the challenge. There's a lot of, doomsday scenarios associated with thinking about climate change. But I think we have a huge opportunity here. A lot of times we just think about this as an extra cost that we're going to incur to get the same services that we were already getting from these other systems. And the reality of the situation is we could really use this as an opportunity to design a much better world. So, over 2 billion people, 2.5 billion people don't have access to sanitation. Nearly 1 billion people don't have access to clean water. We already talked about how many people that don't have access to basic electricity services. There's a lot of people that are food insecure. So there's a lot of people on this planet that already don't have their basic needs met. And this can be an opportunity to get some of those resources to those communities. I do a lot on the water side. I see the water crisis as kind of an energy crisis, because if you had really, really cheap, clean electricity, you could pump water, you could treat water, you could move water to where people need it. It's really an energy issue at the heart of it. Energy costs a lot of money. So installing this water infrastructure and operating that costs a lot of money because of that. So electrifying the communities that don't have access to basic electricity services is a really good way to give them a better quality of life. And then if we move up the income ladder to, lower middle income countries that might have access to electricity, but maybe it's coming at the expense of a lot of pollution from coal-fired power plants, or burning biomass for cooking, or even burning coal in the winter for heating, those communities are devastated by the health consequences of pollution, air pollution. Of any of the things that kill us, air pollution is number one for the things that we can't really control. We can control whether we smoke or not. We can control some elements of our lifestyle and some of the negative outcomes that come from that. But for most people around the world, you can't really change where you live. So you are kind of subject to the amount of pollution that your local community has. And pollution is quite devastating for our public health. And so this transition also gives communities the opportunity to get cleaner and cleaner and cleaner over time. Right now we're getting electricity, but we're getting electricity with a lot of other stuff like SOx and NOx and smog and particulates, etc. So we're also going to clean up over time. We're not only going to fix carbon, we're also going to fix air pollution, which is a really big opportunity. And then I think the third opportunity that I don't think we think enough about is, how do we bring economic development to the places that need it by leapfrogging these technologies? So we've lived in a world where traditionally, to get rich, first you have to pollute a lot. So if you look at the business models of countries that have gotten richer over time, China, really, really dirty, polluting industries make it richer, and then it cleans up, things get a little bit more expensive. And that comes with economic development. That business model is what we've used over time. We did it in Europe, we did it in the United States. You do polluting industries, then you outsource them somewhere else, and you put in environmental regulation. Places like Africa could skip all that. We could give them clean technologies that facilitate clean industries with these much cheaper technologies, and they can skip the whole part where they pollute themselves and they devastate their public health with these pollution consequences. So I think there's huge good news ahead, and I think society actually gets a lot better. We just have to figure out how to get there, economically, environmentally, and socially sustainably.
Yeah, that's really great to hear. Is there any advice that you would give to rising young professionals, students in the field, whether engineering or any other field, on how they can make an impact in this space?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that I'm so drawn to energy is it's not limited to engineering, it's not limited to law, it's not limited to business, it's not limited to the sciences. Literally everyone can be a part of that. And by the way, it's also not limited to people with college degrees. I think there's a great need in this country to invest in the people that can actually do stuff with their hands, welders, people that can install solar panels and transmission lines. So there's huge job opportunities here. The business models, so traditional utility business models of paying for kilowatt hours of electricity, for many, many reasons that I won't go into, that business model is breaking. Just thinking about our electricity system from a supply side, you turn on your lights, you turn on your TV, and electricity comes out without thinking about the system. those days are over. We need technologies that can help us make decisions about the way that we use energy. We need technologies that moderate when we charge our electric cars so that we match it with the timing of solar. This transition is going to facilitate so many new industries and so many new job opportunities that I really just urge, the upcoming generation that's thinking about jobs and what comes next, just learn as much as you can about this space, because, it's really it's almost like the next industrial revolution. Like, things are going to change so fast. And whether you're interested in the technology or the policy or the regulatory requirements of this transition, there's gigantic opportunities abound. So I think it's actually, I think there's a lot of doom and gloom right now about the prospects of jobs with artificial intelligence and the robots taking all of our jobs and the algorithms taking all of our jobs. This is a space where there is just so much potential for people to do really well in. So I think that's one of the really, really bright lights of the climate transition.
Well, thank you so much for your time and insight today. We really appreciate it. And thanks for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we will hear from your 3 students, Stepp, McKenna, and Andrew.
Well, on this next segment of our episode of Energy Transition Talks, I want to welcome to the podcast 3 graduate students working with Dr. Kelly Sanders, who we had as our kind of expert interviewer. And we want to welcome all 3 of you. And rather than me try to butcher your introductions, I'm going to ask each of you to kind of introduce yourself and to talk a little bit about why you were what's caused you, inspired you to pursue your doctoral degree in this area of energy. And then the last thing, and so this is the kind of the standard question we're asking everybody, is what does the word energy transition mean to you? So take it away, you guys.
Cool, I can go ahead. So I'm Stepp, he, him, and I, as you mentioned, am one of Dr. Sanders' students, and I've been researching energy. And I got really excited about energy because I think it's so fundamental to our human existence. It influences our health, our environment, our social systems, but it also does that in like a myriad of ways. So it's a very complicated problem that makes it very fascinating. So I think that there's like this large potential positive impact working in energy, but it's also just like a really interesting problem. And in terms of the energy transition, I think that for me, the energy transition is about changing both our energy sources and also our energy consumption patterns in a way that is sustainable and protects our environment and increases equity.
I'm McKenna. I also work with Kelly Sanders. I became interested in doing an energy doctoral degree in my undergraduate when I was doing the peace engineering minor, and that kind of combined some of our technical engineering classes also with some social analyses, and was really focused on how we can develop some sustainable community-centered solutions, especially for people that are experiencing injustices. And in those courses, we talked about a lot of different global issues and issues facing our society that we could use engineering solutions to kind of mitigate those problems. And I just really felt like climate change was the most pressing issue and something that I was excited to work on and try to develop solutions for. And so energy was kind of the next step that made sense for me. And I think of the energy transition broadly as being a switch from high carbon energy systems to low carbon energy systems. And this is both so that we can mitigate global warming, but also so that we can adapt to some of the effects of climate change that people are already experiencing. And this means a lot of different things. Like, most obviously, everybody knows renewable energy. I think there's a lot of different technologies and strategies that'll all be included in the efforts and in the solution to combat global warming.
Awesome. And I guess that just leaves me, the third of these three musketeers. Hi, everyone. My name's Andrew, Andrew Jin. I'm a doctoral candidate, also under Kelly Sanders. All three of us joined at the same time. And I was really interested from a young age in going into like climate change policy and climate change mitigation. So growing up, I participated in this competition from the DOE, the Department of Energy, called Science Bowl. So this is probably the nerdiest of the three answers that you're going to get, where I was speaking to all of these DOE scientists and policymakers, and they really like inspired me to want to become an expert in energy systems. And that's why I joined this lab group, and why it informs a lot of the research that I do now. For me, the energy transition is much more about some of these large-scale changes that are happening, and it's really targeted towards a lot of the opportunities we have to shift how we use energy throughout our lives, to not only support climate change mitigation, but also to support community building and to support just transitions, such that we can make sure that everybody has a lot of the opportunities to use energy in an equitable fashion, and so that we can convert a lot of our lives to something that is more sustainable and more fits the needs of communities as they start to change throughout a lot of these changing conditions of the climate.
The topic of our episode is just transition. So all of you really hit upon that theme. I think one of the purposes of the podcast in terms of public outreach and education is to try to talk all of the elements of it. And you guys have touched on a bunch of them. I mean, most people just think, well, it's a move from fossil fuels to wind and solar, and then that's probably all they think about it. But all of you have kind of gone deeper and talking about the demand issues, about the sustainable, quality of life issues, and all of the other kind of aspects of energy. So that's fantastic. So my next question is really is for McKenna and Andrew, because of your particular research topics that I know you're dealing a lot with the vulnerability to extreme heat and access to critical services like air conditioning and public cooling centers and things like that. So could both of you talk a little bit about your research regarding heat vulnerability?
Yeah, so in my research, I look specifically at AC penetration rates, which is the percentage of households in a given region that have air conditioning. And I'm specifically looking at the Southern California region, which a lot of the research in our lab is narrowed in on that area. And it's an interesting test bed because, one, there's a lot of diversity of housing stocks, socioeconomics, and microclimates. And then also it actually has significantly lower rates of AC ownership than most of the US. So we'll likely see a lot of growth in this region in the upcoming years. And historically, this wasn't as much of an issue because there are large areas throughout Southern California that actually have more mild temperatures, and people aren't frequently experiencing some of those extreme temperatures. But in our lab's work, we've looked at AC ownership and vulnerability and found that there are a lot of communities that are in the lowest income brackets with the lowest rates of AC penetration that are projected to experience a significant number of extreme heat days in the future due to climate change. So it's really important that we can identify these communities so that we have some insight into where those future energy needs are as more homes adopt air conditioning, and then the homes that already have air conditioning are using the air conditioner more often, and also so that we can craft policies that can help mitigate some of the consequences of climate change for these populations that are going to be really vulnerable to extreme heat.
Yeah, and just adding on to that, a lot of the really cool work that's happening in this energy transition, and Jim, I'm really glad you brought up the fact that this energy transition is not just to renewables, it's about all of these changes throughout the electricity system. We're using smart meter data, which is giving us really cool insights into how residents themselves are using electricity, which isn't something that we've been able to do throughout many, many decades of work, because we haven't been able to take a peek into how electricity is used on the ground. So McKenna and my work largely focuses on trying to gain insights into how a population in general is shifting their electricity usage to some of these climate pressures. McKenna's been identifying some of these big changes in air conditioning, while I've been working more to understand how some of these changes might occur throughout the day. And what we can see is that people aren't using electricity equally throughout the day, that there's pretty big differences in the types of households and how they use electricity throughout the intraday period, but also, throughout the year. So in Southern California, especially, this is pretty obvious if you look at something comparing, desert regions of Southern California to something towards the coast. It's not just in the air conditioning usage, but when people are using electricity, and how much electricity they're using. And not everybody uses air conditioning as their main source of cooling response. Some people just can't afford air conditioning usage, or they might rely on other resources. So some of my work has also been looking at public cooling infrastructure. Traditionally, cities will be providing something called like a cooling center, in which they'll open up a library or a park to all of their citizens, so that if they did need some type of air conditioning, they could come. But what we've seen is that throughout things like COVID-19, throughout financial struggles, these have started to be deprioritized, but they are essential for a lot of the cooling needs of some of the most vulnerable populations. So in Southern California, starting to understand these different behaviors of how people are using electricity is going to be really, really important to understand how we can make sure that people have this not just comfort, but health critical air conditioning on some of the most extreme weathered days.
Well, it's cool that you guys are really focusing on the community level. And, we've had a lot of kind of talk before that there's no one size fits all. And you're an absolute example of getting down into the details. And it might be even a particular family's demand. It might be a community. It might be where you plant trees. It might be, what color paint you put on roofs. I mean, there's a lot of really small issues. So for both of you, given your research so far and what you've seen, and I guess I read an article that said the one piece of good news about Phoenix's heat dome problem was the fact the grid didn't fail, right? If the grid would have failed, even though it's been stressed, and it's been stressed in Texas, it's been stressed in California and other places, if it would have failed, it would have been a health catastrophe with regard to the people vulnerability to heat. So how has your research impacted how you personally think about that term, just transition?
So for me, as I focus on air conditioning access, that's obviously something that I'm thinking about what that would look like globally and not just in Southern California. And as you mentioned previously, the issues that are happening in Southern California, the solutions might look a lot different than what they look like on the other side of the globe. So as I mentioned, Southern California is going to see a lot of adoption, at least compared to other parts of the US, but this is kind of really small growth compared to what we're going to see in other parts of the globe, especially some of the developing countries, which is often also where we're seeing some of the most deadly heat waves already occurring and going to occur with more frequency and intensity in the future. And so a lot of those countries are where we'll see a really huge increase in AC ownership. The EIA projects that by 2050, the global cooling capacity will triple. And so that's really great because AC is a key adaptation tool against the effects of heat stress, and it can save a lot of lives during these really extreme heat events. But I'm also really thinking about what does that mean in the context of the energy transition? So how can we meet this huge growth in demand that these countries are going to have, because they also need AC just as badly as we do, but how can we ensure that we're meeting that with low carbon energy systems, I think is going to be a challenge in the future.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I'm really glad you kind of brought up some of these like community versus system scale differences in the energy transition, because I think a lot of our research is trying to understand how individuals might use electricity differently than the system in general. So understanding, how many people have AC is incredibly important, but it's also understanding when is AC being used, and like, there's different patterns into how people are using electricity, or how people are not using energy. Maybe they're going to cooling centers. Maybe they're going to malls and pools and other different resources in their communities that do cost energy, but aren't going to be captured in their own individual energy usage. So what this has really meant for me in this understanding of the just transition is that the energy transition is not by its own nature going to be a just transition. That we do need to have some key work in understanding how different people are going to be using energy differently, and how these types of transitions are going to impact individuals, and what those responses are, because we can design systems that are optimizing for emissions or for lower cost energy, but that might influence a lot of the day-to-day lives of people who might be most vulnerable to some of the impacts of climate change. Somebody who who requires energy for something like a medical device, that's not going to change whether it's sunny out and there's a lot of solar electricity or not. And understanding, how are these differences occurring, who needs energy at these specific times, and how that we can fit the needs of the community members, and individual households that are being affected by these energy changes is really important, and a lot of where our research is centered.
Yeah, what you're saying is getting real personal for me, because my 96-year-old mother lives in a house that was built in 1955, and was no air conditioning anywhere around it. So we have to watch and check on her, and then maybe some days take her out to lunch in a air conditioned restaurant or something, or even bring her to our home, which is much newer. And those are kind of getting down to what it means to me and what it means to individual choices. And one household may be different than the next household, and maybe in one place it's energy efficiency and cut down waste, and maybe another it's they have to have that power all the time to, as you said, keep a medical device going or something like that. So those are really kind of important themes. Well, Stepp, we didn't want to leave you out of all of this. Your work has looked a lot on how we transition the power grid to higher penetrations of renewable energy. And we've talked a little bit in some of our expert interviews about the famous California duck curve, where you have curtailment of energy in the afternoon, and then 2 hours later, when you get home and you want to replug in your Tesla, you can't do it because there's an energy deficit. Can you talk a little bit about some of the ways that you think we can make progress towards both this dual challenge of decarbonization while protecting vulnerable populations, and the whole idea of energy prices, as well as some of the climate extremes?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that I don't think when we talk about rising prices, I don't think the story of this energy transition is rising energy prices. I think renewable resources are they're very cheap, they're very abundant. I think we absolutely have the ability to build up these resources and without exposing people to higher prices, and actually protecting people from higher prices. I think that as we make the transition, there's some strategies that we can use. So obviously a very popular one for dealing with what you mentioned, the duck curve, is talking about storage. But also there's opportunity on the consumer side, the end user side, which is shifting consumption patterns. So that's something that I look at a lot in my research, which is because we have this issue where we have so much demand at night and in the evening and so little renewable supply, that's a time where we really want to shift demand from one time period to another. And that is the time under our current system that people are most likely to be exposed to higher energy prices. So it's really important to think about what behaviors we can shift, whether that's cooling, whether that's cooking, whether that's using your dryer and your washing machine. And some of those small shifts can save people money and protect people from higher prices without necessarily forcing them to give up any resources. But I don't think that, that we need to be so concerned about the energy part of this transition driving up prices. I think it's more we're looking at demand impacting prices. And that's really, we're thinking about that more in terms of climate change and, the urban heat island effect. And I think the last thing I would add to that is if we did start to see an issue where there was this disconnect between making this really necessary energy transition from a sustainability perspective and an environmental protection perspective, we started to see a disconnect where that was causing higher energy prices for people who need to, get ACs and use them. It was jeopardizing their health. Then one thing that could be considered is moving more of the energy sector from the private sector to the public sector. And that's a very controversial idea because of the popularity of things like microgrids and a lot of distributed energy resources. There's kind of a trend towards smaller and smaller grids and smaller sector level dynamics. But I think it would be something worth considering is just moving more in a public direction.
Well, there's also, I'd say, lots of trends going in lots of different directions, as I'm sure and maybe, in a rich neighborhood, you can afford the solar panels on your roof, and you can then have maybe a local energy security kind of agreement with yourself, right? But in another place, if you've got a bunch of people living in apartments or whatever, they don't have that choice, and so
Absolutely.
The equity.
Yeah.
Well, to finish this out, but can you give us a reason that you are hopeful about the energy transition that'll be able to improve the livelihoods of community more globally, particularly those who lack access to adequate energy services? Let's end on a positive note. What makes you hopeful?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give kind of one local answer and one more global answer. So on the local side, one thing I'm really excited about is some of the transitions that actually will happen, the part of the energy transition that will happen on the end user side, on the consumer side. So I'm thinking about just technologies like heat pumps and electric vehicles and all of this electrification process that we're really excited about. I think that is going to be a way that we can achieve both more efficient systems and also a really high level of performance where people are having their needs met. So I'm really optimistic about more and more grids from day one or close to day one. With renewable energy, we can avoid all of the damage that would have been done like through air pollution if we had started those grids with fossil fuels. So I think that's something that we really need to invest in and support as much as possible right now.
Yeah, I'll actually expand a little bit on what Stepp said because I'm also hopeful about the impact that renewable energy can have. And in addition to what Stepp was saying, also from an environmental justice aspect, because we know that there's communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. Everyone's impacted, but not everyone's impacted equally. And so this is true on multiple scales. We know that throughout the US and in other countries globally, that a lot of times low income or communities of color are exposed to heavier pollution. Just for example, because it's more likely that the facilities that are responsible for these emissions are being located in their neighborhoods. And if you're talking on a global scale, it's often that the countries that have contributed least to the climate crisis are the ones that are experiencing the greatest impacts. So I think that's one of the reasons that I'm optimistic about the impacts that renewable energy can have. And the energy transition in general, because cleaner energy can relieve some of these unequal burdens that are placed on communities, and also the solutions and policies that we're developing to replace our current systems can create a more sustainable and equitable energy future for everyone.
Yeah, so I think for me, the biggest thing is a lot of the fact that the energy transition has a huge opportunity into democratizing energy usage, especially in a lot of what Stepp said and McKenna have mentioned is renewable energies giving people access to smaller scale smaller scale resources that they could potentially control, but also in democratizing our access to information. It has this opportunity to give people more information into their hands, to be able to say, this is when I'm using my electricity usage, to go to policymakers to argue, hey, I can even see now, and I have the data to prove that, I need to use electricity at this time, or things like that, so that communities have the opportunity to argue for their own energy needs. There's a big caveat here, which is that we need to be open to understanding what communities need in their electricity usage. We need to leave space for this democratization of energy. There's huge opportunities as this transition occurs for many voices to dominate and to crowd out some of these communities, and to prevent a just transition. But you see so many of these opportunities come up, whether it's neighborhoods grouping together to purchase solar, or whether it's even just different households switching to electric stoves or changing their electricity behaviors to meet climate change needs. We have all this opportunity to take it into our own hands, and we need to be able to push the system to fit our energy needs of the future.
Well, we want to thank all three of you. It's been great to hear your perspective and voices up. One of the purposes of our podcast is to reach out to the community, and I think you guys have been, all of your research is really focused in that kind of thing, whether you're looking at the data or the systems or local use. Is there any last words that you would give, looking at the microphone, talking to the some of the people that you're studying their challenges, that you would like to leave us with?
So I think just getting involved in any of these conversations, and I know tools like this podcast that can bring some researchers connect with community members is incredibly important. But even when we have conversations, whether it's any of us researchers with our families, with friends, and getting to understand how people use electricity differently, understanding what some of these needs are, it always informs our own research, and it always helps us to understand how we can make our research useful to other people. So never be afraid to kind of just discuss your energy usage, because as Stepp mentioned at the beginning of the segment, it's such an important part of all of our lives. We use energy every single day, even if we don't notice it. Whether that's driving a car, whether that's turning on the lights in our homes, whether it's just eating food, energy is such an integral part. And adding to the conversation, starting to realize that energy is a part of your daily life, that's such a huge component into taking this just transition and this just energy transition into our own hands, and to empower ourselves to shift our energy usage to what our needs are in the future.
So improving our energy IQ so we can make better choices.
Yes, very much so.
Well, I would just say thank you all for having us. It was really fun to be on here. I think that I agree with what Andrew said and how you summarized it within improving your energy IQ. And I think it's also about the community of energy and your role in the community. And I think that because energy is a complex issue, or it's was less of a local issue for a long time, it's not something that people interacted with, or it's not something where it's really easy to see the impact on your neighbor, but there is an impact that we have. Our behaviors impact each other, and we should be taking on this issue as a community and from a perspective of caring about each other, and I'm really optimistic about that.
Well, thanks. McKenna, you get the last word.
I think mine kind of ties into both what Andrew and Stepp have said, but maybe just not to feel so hopeless about it. I think I'll have friends that reach out to me because they know that this is an area that I work in, and they'll ask what they can do, or if there's any small changes that they can make in their life. And it's easy to kind of feel as though this is out of our hands, and it's really comes down to corporations and governments and all the changes they need to make, which is true. Without corporations cooperating, without government making policies that is what we need, and we won't be able to decarbonize without them. But I think it's made me personally feel better to make small changes in my life when I can, and like Andrew said, talk to people about it. And there's a million podcasts like this one where you can learn more about what you can do in your everyday life. And I think that those small conversations really do make a difference in the energy transition going forward, and how other people perceive it, and how people vote, and the changes that are made at bigger scales.
So small conversations make a difference. We've had a theme that the energy transition is up to us. It's up to each one of us. And want to thank all three of you for just really, building on that point. So good luck with your research.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There is a lot to digest in this episode. I want to thank our guests for sharing their insights and experiences with us, and for an informative and inspiring conversation. I hope all of you enjoyed it as much as we did. Despite such a difficult topic, we ended up on an optimistic note. If you want to learn more about energy, water, and climate systems, check out some of the resources in the show notes.
So for now, we leave our audience until next time. We hope you understand a little more about the story of the energy transition, as we are all learning and exploring this together, because at the end, energy transition is up to you. So thank you all so much for tuning in to the Energy Transition Talk. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for the topics you want to hear about in the future podcasts, please visit our YouTube page and any other places where you're getting your podcast. We welcome all your feedback.
We would like to thank the USC Oshagi Center for Energy Transition, which aims to develop innovations in energy technologies and foster the transition to a low-carbon future, for sponsoring this podcast. Special thanks also to our guests for today and Abby, our technical guru, for their important contributions to our podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so that you can automatically get access to our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Justine.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Paulina.
Signing off from the Energy Transition Talk. Stay tuned for the next episode.